Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we are tackling the world of dermatitis.
Yeah.
And we'll be taking all of our information from the Wikipedia article on dermatitis. And, just a quick glance at that article, and I can tell you already, this is a lot more than just putting on some lotion, huh?
It really is. It's not a simple thing. Dermatitis. There's so many different types of dermatitis, and each of them, has its own causes and treatments and things like that. And that's why we're here, so we can sort of give you a more in-depth look at what dermatitis is all about.
Okay, so let's just get right into it then. One thing that I think is interesting right off the bat is how we use the terms eczema and dermatitis almost like they're the same thing. But I'm guessing there is actually a difference. Where does that confusion come from?
Yeah, so you're right. There is a difference, and you're right that there's a lot of confusion. Dermatitis is kind of the overall term, right? It's the general term for any kind of skin inflammation.
Yeah.
And eczema is often used as a synonym for dermatitis. And in fact, it's most often used to refer to the most common type of dermatitis, which is atopic dermatitis. So you're right, there is a difference. And the terms are often used interchangeably.
So it's kind of like when we say Band-Aid, but we're really talking about any adhesive bandage.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's like a brand name that has become the common term.
Okay, I got it. So dermatitis, it's the big umbrella, and then there are all these different types underneath it.
Exactly.
But before we get into all of those, I think it would be helpful to know, how do you even know if you're dealing with dermatitis? I mean, what are the signs and symptoms that should make you think, maybe this is more than just dry skin?
Right, good point. Because lots of things can cause skin irritation.
Yeah.
So how do you know? Well, usually the first thing that'll make you suspicious is the itch. And not just a mild itch. I'm talking about like an intense, persistent itch. That's often the hallmark of dermatitis.
Okay, so more than just your average, bug bite itch. Got it.
Exactly. Much more intense. And it can be really disruptive. It can keep you up at night, make it hard to concentrate.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine.
And then, of course, there's the rash itself. You usually see some redness, some swelling. Often you'll get what are called lesions.
Lesions. That sounds a little scary.
Yeah, it can sound alarming. But it's just a general term for any kind of abnormal change in the skin. So it could be anything from little bumps to patches of dry, scaly skin. You might see blisters, oozing, crusting. It really depends on the type of dermatitis and how severe it is.
Okay, so we're talking the whole spectrum of not so pretty skin stuff.
Pretty much, yeah.
And this can show up anywhere on the body, right?
Yeah, it can. It can. Atopic dermatitis, which is the most common type, frequently shows up, in those bendy places like the insides of your elbows or behind your knees.
Yeah.
But you can get it on your hands, your face. I mean, really anywhere.
Oh, even like your scalp.
Oh, yeah. The scalp is definitely a common spot. It can be really frustrating, especially for kids.
Yeah. And, speaking of things that are frustrating, the Wikipedia article mentions some pretty serious complications that can happen with dermatitis. Like, there's that thing about the smallpox vaccine.
Right. That's definitely something to be aware of. So people with eczema, if they get the smallpox vaccine, they're at an increased risk of developing something called eczema vaccinatum. And it's basically a much more severe, widespread reaction to the vaccine. So it's really important to talk to your doctor if you have eczema and you're considering getting the smallpox vaccine.
Okay, good to know. And it's not just the smallpox vaccine either. The article says eczema can actually make you more susceptible to other infections in general. I mean, why is that?
Well, think about your skin as a barrier, right?
Okay, yeah.
It's your first line of defense against all the germs and stuff in the environment. Well, eczema, disrupts that barrier. It creates cracks and openings in the skin, which allow bacteria and viruses to get in more easily.
Ah, so it's like your skin's security system is compromised.
Exactly. And on top of that, there are also some immune system quirks that seem to be at play in eczema. So it's not just a weak barrier, it's also a less effective immune response.
So it's like a double whammy. Yikes.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's get to the root of it then. What causes all of this in the first place? Why do some people get dermatitis and others don't?
That is the million-dollar question. And the truth is, it's not always a simple answer. Often it's a complex mix of genetics and environmental factors, nature and nurture working together, you could say.
Right, like so many things in health, it seems. So let's break those two down a bit. Starting with the environmental side of things, the Wikipedia article mentions this intriguing hygiene hypothesis. Have you heard of that?
Oh, yeah. It's a fascinating theory. It basically suggests that being too clean, especially in early childhood, could actually increase your risk of developing allergies and eczema.
Wait, so you're saying playing in the dirt is good for you?
Well, the idea is that early exposure to certain bacteria and other microorganisms helps to train the immune system to react appropriately.
Ah, I see.
So without that exposure, the immune system might kind of overreact to things that aren't actually threats. And that can lead to allergies and inflammatory conditions like eczema.
So our immune systems need a little boot camp in the dirt to learn how to fight the real battles. That's kind of cool. And speaking of environment, the article also mentions that eczema rates are higher in urban areas compared to rural areas. Does that support the hygiene hypothesis?
It's certainly suggestive, isn't it? Because urban environments tend to be cleaner in some ways.
Yeah, less exposure to the natural world.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But of course, there could be other factors at play too, like pollution or differences in diet. It's
Yeah.
complicated.
Right. Okay, so the urban versus rural thing is something to consider. What about allergens like dust mites? Those are a big trigger for eczema, right?
Well, they can be. Studies have shown that people with eczema often have antibodies to dust mites, which suggests an allergic reaction. But it's not entirely clear how big of a role they play overall. It seems to vary from person to person.
Okay, so dust mites, possible culprit, but not the whole story. You know,
Right.
what I found really interesting in the Wikipedia article was the link between malnutrition and eczema-like symptoms.
Oh, yeah.
Specifically, it mentioned a deficiency in essential fatty acids.
Right. That's fascinating. It shows how interconnected everything is.
Yeah, so true.
And how important a balanced diet is, not just for our overall health, but for our skin health too.
You are what you eat, as they say. Now, on the genetic side of things, the article talks about a gene involved in producing a skin protein called filaggrin. Does that ring a bell?
Oh, yeah. Filaggrin is essential for a healthy skin barrier. And variations in the gene that makes filaggrin can definitely increase the risk of developing eczema.
Okay, so a faulty gene leads to faulty filaggrin, which weakens the skin barrier. That makes sense. But how does filaggrin actually work?
Well, it's kind of like the mortar between the bricks of your skin cells. So if you imagine a brick wall where the mortar is crumbling away, that's kind of what happens with faulty filaggrin. The skin barrier becomes leaky, it allows moisture to escape, and irritants to get in.
Oh, that's a great analogy. So it's all about maintaining that strong, solid wall to protect your skin.
Exactly.
And speaking of interesting connections, the article mentions a link between eczema and celiac disease, the gluten intolerance.
Oh, yes, there's definitely a connection there. Studies have found that people with celiac disease are 3 times more likely to have eczema.
Wow, 3 times.
Yeah. And their relatives are also at increased risk. So there seems to be a shared genetic component between the two conditions.
That's wild. So if you have celiac disease or if you know someone who does, eczema is something to be on the lookout for, and maybe vice versa, right?
Absolutely. It's always a good idea to get checked out if you have any concerns. And it just goes to show you, how complex these conditions can be.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so we've covered the basics, signs and symptoms, environmental factors, genetics, but now I'm really curious to dive into all those different types of dermatitis. The Wikipedia article mentions quite a few,
I know.
some with some pretty wild-sounding names.
Yeah, it's a whole jungle out there. But don't worry, we'll break it down for you.
Okay, good, because I'm ready to explore that jungle.
All right, let's do it.
All right, so we've talked about the general signs and symptoms of dermatitis and some of the things that might make you more prone to it. But now I'm kind of curious about all those different types. The Wikipedia article just throws around names like dishidrosis and dermatitis, like herpetiformis, like it's a lot.
Yeah, it can feel like a whole other language, I know. But don't worry, we'll break it down for you. So maybe we should just start with the most common type, the one we've already mentioned, atopic dermatitis.
Yeah, let's do that. Atopic dermatitis. It's the one that often starts in childhood, runs in families. What else makes this one unique?
Well, one of the key things about atopic dermatitis is that it's allergic in nature. So the immune system is definitely involved. It's overreacting to things that wouldn't bother most people. And remember that filaggrin gene we talked about?
Yeah.
Variations in that gene are very strongly linked to atopic dermatitis.
So genetics and a hyped up immune system, kind of a recipe for trouble. Okay, so then what does this actually look like on the skin?
Well, if you're picturing like red, dry, itchy patches, you're on the right track. And those patches often show up in those typical places, like the insides of your elbows, behind the knees, sometimes on the face.
Right, that classic eczema look.
Yeah.
But is it always dry patches, or can it look different?
It definitely can vary, depending on the person, how severe it is. Sometimes the patches are more weepy and oozing, especially in babies. And in chronic cases, the skin can actually thicken and become leathery from all the scratching.
Oh man, that must be so uncomfortable. Okay, so atopic dermatitis. We kind of have a picture of that in our minds now. What about contact dermatitis? That one seems pretty straightforward. It's all about something you've touched, right?
Exactly. Contact dermatitis is all about a reaction to something your skin has come into direct contact with. And there are two main types: allergic contact dermatitis and irritant contact dermatitis.
Okay, so two sides of the same coin, basically. But how do they differ? I mean, isn't any reaction to something you touch an allergy?
Well, that's a good question. It is a little nuanced. Allergic contact dermatitis is a true allergic reaction. It's a delayed immune response to something that your body perceives as a threat.
So like poison ivy.
Exactly. Poison ivy is a classic example. But also think about things like nickel allergy from jewelry or reactions to certain fragrances or preservatives in cosmetics. Your body's essentially saying, wait, this doesn't belong here. And it launches this whole immune attack.
So it's not that the substance itself is harmful necessarily, it's your body's like overreaction to it.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about the irritant type?
Well, irritant contact dermatitis it's more of a direct assault on the skin. It's not an immune response. It's just irritation from something that damages the skin's natural protective barrier.
So like if you wash your hands a lot and they get all dry and cracked.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. Harsh soaps, detergents, solvents, even things like hand sanitizer, anything that strips away the skin's natural oils can cause irritant contact dermatitis. And it's a huge problem in certain occupations where people are, constantly exposed to these kinds of things.
Right, right. Okay, so contact dermatitis, either you're allergic or it's just irritating. Okay, I got it. Now, what about that seborrheic dermatitis? The Wikipedia article says it's related to dandruff, right?
That's right. Seborrheic dermatitis is often associated with dandruff, those flaky bits on the scalp. But it can affect other areas too, like the face, the eyebrows, chest, back even.
So more than just an itchy scalp. Okay.
Yep. And what makes seborrheic dermatitis really interesting is that it's often linked to a specific type of fungus that lives on everyone's skin.
Wait, a fungus? So is it contagious?
No, not at all. We all have this fungus that's called Malassezia on our skin, but for some reason in certain people, it triggers this inflammatory response that leads to seborrheic dermatitis.
So it's not about catching the fungus, it's about how your body reacts to it. Okay, interesting. I think you mentioned earlier that antifungal shampoos can actually help with seborrheic dermatitis.
That's right. Because of that fungus link. Using an antifungal shampoo, like the kind you might use for dandruff, can be really effective, even on areas like the face or chest.
Huh, so those anti-dandruff shampoos are more versatile than I thought. Okay, we've covered atopic, contact, seborrheic. I know there are a lot of other types, some with pretty wild names. Do we want to try to tackle a few more, or should we?
Well, we could certainly do a rapid-fire round, but I think it might be more helpful to focus on one that's particularly intriguing and that has a connection to something we've already talked about, celiac disease.
Oh, yeah. You mentioned that people with celiac disease are more likely to have eczema. Is there a specific type of dermatitis that's linked to that?
There is. It's called dermatitis herpetiformis.
Okay, dermatitis herpetiform. That's a mouthful. What makes this one so special?
Well, first of all, the rash itself is very distinctive. It's super itchy, and it tends to appear in a symmetrical pattern on both sides of the body. So, on the elbows, knees, buttocks, back, scalp.
So itchy and symmetrical, not a good combination.
Not at all. And what makes this really interesting is that almost everyone with dermatitis herpetiformis also has celiac disease, even if they don't have any digestive symptoms.
Wow. So you could have celiac disease and not even know it, and it just shows up as a skin rash.
Exactly. And the amazing thing is, if you treat the celiac disease by going gluten-free, the dermatitis often clears right up.
That is incredible. So this dermatitis herpetiformis is like a clue, a signal that there's something else going on.
Exactly. And it really highlights the importance of, looking beyond the surface, of understanding that skin conditions can be a reflection of, what's happening elsewhere in the body.
Okay, powerful takeaway there. If you've got this really itchy, symmetrical rash, definitely get checked for celiac disease. Now, I know we could probably spend hours talking about all the different types of dermatitis, but maybe we should shift gears a bit and talk about what people can actually do about it. I mean, is there anything you can do to prevent these conditions in the first place?
Well, the thing about prevention is it's a little tricky. With some conditions, there are really clear steps you can take to prevent them. But with dermatitis, it's not always so straightforward.
Right, because we were talking about how genetics play such a big role, and obviously you can't change your genes.
Exactly. And even with the environmental factors, there's still a lot we don't know for sure. Like the Wikipedia article mentions breastfeeding, whether it makes a difference in preventing eczema.
Yeah, I was curious about that.
So some studies suggest that exclusive breastfeeding for at least the first few months might reduce the risk, but the evidence isn't super strong.
Okay, so it might help, but no guarantees.
Right. And there's this whole idea that what a mother eats during pregnancy or while breastfeeding can affect the baby's risk of developing eczema.
Oh yeah, I've heard about that, like avoiding certain food.
Well, there's been a lot of research on this, and so far there's no strong evidence to support that.
Really? So all those restrictions might not even be necessary.
That seems to be the case, at least for now. More research could always change things, but the current evidence doesn't really support those dietary restrictions.
Huh, interesting. Well, that might be good news for some moms out there.
Yeah, yeah, potentially less stress. And, another thing that people often ask about is whether early introduction of certain foods can increase the risk of eczema.
Oh, like delaying when you give babies things like peanuts or eggs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But again, the research on this is kind of surprising. It seems like early introduction of those potentially allergenic foods probably doesn't increase the risk of eczema.
Really? So it's actually the opposite of what we used to think.
Right. It's kind of counterintuitive.
Okay, so we're debunking some myths here today.
I like to think so. And, one more thing on the prevention front.
Uh-huh.
There's been some research on whether daily moisturizing in infancy can help prevent eczema.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Keep that baby's skin soft and hydrated.
You think so, right. But actually, the studies have shown that it doesn't seem to prevent eczema, and it might even increase the risk of skin infections.
Oh, wow. So sometimes less is more, I guess.
It seems that way. All right, so prevention is tricky. But, what about managing the symptoms? What can people do to get relief when those flare-ups happen?
Yeah, because let's face it, even if you can't always prevent it, you still have to deal with the itch and the rash and all of that.
Exactly. And that's where those lifestyle tips we talked about earlier come in. Things like taking lukewarm baths, avoiding harsh soaps, moisturizing regularly. Those can all make a big difference.
I know from personal experience that sometimes even the gentlest soaps can make my skin feel irritated.
Oh, yeah. I totally get that.
So I can imagine how challenging it must be for people with dermatitis to navigate those daily routines.
Absolutely. It's a constant balancing act,
Yeah.
trying to keep your skin clean without triggering a flare-up. And speaking of, things that sound counterintuitive, did you know that the American Academy of Dermatology actually recommends dilute bleach baths for people with atopic dermatitis?
Wait, bleach, like the stuff we use to clean the bathroom?
I know, right? It sounds kind of crazy. But a very dilute bleach bath, like a tiny amount in a full tub of water, can actually help reduce bacteria on the skin.
Yeah.
And remember, we were talking about how eczema compromises that skin barrier.
Right. Makes it more susceptible to infection.
Exactly. So the bleach bath is a way to kind of help prevent those secondary infections that can make eczema so much worse.
Okay, so it's not about bleaching the skin. It's about making it a less friendly environment for bacteria.
Right. It's creating kind of a protective shield. Of course, it's important to talk to your doctor before trying this at home, just to make sure you're doing it safely and correctly.
Okay, noted. Bleach baths. Who knew? All right, so we've got lifestyle changes, and then there's the whole world of medications. Where do those fit in?
Well, moisturizers are really the cornerstone of any dermatitis treatment plan. And I'm not just talking about slapping on any old lotion. We're talking about emollients. Those are thicker, more occlusive moisturizers that really help to repair and protect that damaged skin barrier.
So they're not just moisturizing, they're actually helping to rebuild the skin's defenses.
That's the idea. And while the research isn't perfect, studies suggest that consistent use of emollients can reduce the severity of symptoms and even help prevent flare-ups.
So lotion up people. Are there certain types of moisturizers that work better than others?
That's a good question. It can depend, on the individual, their skin type. But for kids, oil-based formulations seem to be more effective than water-based ones. And there's been a lot of buzz lately about ceramides.
Ceramides. I feel like I've seen those in skincare ads. Do they live up to the hype?
They're definitely promising. But honestly, the jury's still out on whether they're truly superior to other types of moisturizer. More research is needed.
Okay, so choose your moisturizer wisely. But what about when those basic measures aren't enough? What about those stronger medications, like steroids?
Yeah, corticosteroids are definitely effective at reducing inflammation and itching quickly, and they come in various strengths, from mild over-the-counter options to stronger prescription ones, but they do need to be used with caution.
And I've heard that long-term steroid use can have some pretty nasty side effects.
Right. Prolonged use can thin the skin, cause stretch marks, make the skin more sensitive in the long run. So it's really about, finding that balance,
Hmm.
using them strategically to get relief, but not overdoing it.
Okay. Steroids powerful, but proceed with caution. Got it. What about antihistamines? I take those for my allergies. Do they help with dermatitis at all?
Antihistamines are a bit trickier.
Mhm.
There's not a ton of evidence that they actually help with the rash itself.
Yeah.
But but if the itching is keeping you up at night, a sedating antihistamine like dalphenhydramine can be helpful for getting some sleep.
So it's more about managing the symptom, rather than treating the underlying condition.
Right, exactly.
Okay. Are there any other medications besides steroids and antihistamines that are used for dermatitis?
Yes. For people who, don't respond to steroids or who can't use them long term because of the side effects, there are these things called topical immunosuppressants.
Topical immunosuppressants. Okay, that sounds pretty intense.
Yeah, they work by suppressing the immune response in the skin, which helps to calm down the inflammation. Two common ones are pimecrolimus and tacrolimus. They're applied directly to the skin, like a cream.
Interesting. But are they safe to use long term? Messing with the immune system just sounds a little scary, to be honest.
I know. It's a valid concern. But the research so far suggests that topical immunosuppressants are safe, at least when used as directed. And unlike some other immunosuppressants, there's no link to increased risk of skin cancer.
Okay, that's good to know. So they're a potential option for people who are, really struggling with those more severe, stubborn cases. Now, the Wikipedia article also mentions light therapy as a treatment for dermatitis. How does that work?
Yeah, light therapy, specifically narrowband UVB, can be really effective for some types of dermatitis. It basically involves exposing the skin to controlled doses of ultraviolet B light, and that helps to reduce inflammation and itching.
So it's kind of like controlled sun exposure.
In a way, yes,
Yeah.
but it's much more precise and targeted than just going out in the sun. And one of the nice things about narrowband UVB is that it also helps to boost vitamin D production.
So it's a 2-for-1 deal. Are there any downsides to light therapy?
The main concern is overexposure to UV light, which we know can increase the risk of skin cancer. So it's important to do it under the supervision of a dermatologist who can, make sure you're getting the right dose and protecting the rest of your skin.
All right, light therapy. Promising, but proceed with caution. We've talked a lot about conventional treatments. What about alternative medicine? Does anything else work for dermatitis?
To be honest, the evidence for most alternative treatments is pretty weak. There's some buzz about things like Chinese herbal remedies or dietary supplements, but more rigorous research is needed. The one exception, of course, is the antifungal shampoo for seborrheic dermatitis.
Right, right. That one actually makes sense because we know there's a fungus involved, so sometimes those alternative remedies do have a scientific basis.
That's a great point. And it highlights the importance of, being an informed consumer, understanding not just what works, but why it works.
Absolutely. Well, wow, we have covered so much ground today. I feel like I've learned a ton about dermatitis, and I'm sure our listeners have too. What are some key takeaways you want people to remember?
Well, first of all, remember that dermatitis isn't just one thing. It's a whole family of skin conditions, each with its own unique causes, symptoms, and treatment options. So figuring out which type you have is crucial.
Right. And I think what really struck me was that connection between skin health and overall health.
Yeah.
Like how dermatitis can be linked to things like genetics, the immune system, even gut health with that celiac connection.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that everything in the body is interconnected, and sometimes what shows up on our skin can be a clue to what's happening, deeper down.
And finally, I think it's encouraging to know that there are so many different treatment options available, from simple lifestyle changes to medications, even light therapy. It's really about finding what works best for you and your individual situation.
Exactly. And before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought-provoking question. Remember that hygiene hypothesis we talked about earlier? Given that eczema rates are on the rise in, developed nations where we tend to be, hyper clean, could this hypothesis be relevant to your own life? And if so, what small changes could you make to rewild your environment a little bit?
That is a great question to ponder. Maybe a little less hand sanitizer and a little more time digging in the garden is the answer. Who knows? This deep dive is really just the beginning of your journey into understanding dermatitis. Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep that skin healthy and happy. Thanks for joining us.